Hello. These slides were used to present a seminar titled Learning Outcomes Assessment that was presented at the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of South Carolina in January of 2009. And I'm Jed Lyons, the Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, and I teach in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. First, I want to talk about backwards design, and it's called backwards design not because it's the wrong way to design a course, but because it's just different than what most of us have been doing for our professional careers as faculty. When I first started teaching, I would start with the bottom, which was planning my learning experiences for my students and what type of instruction I was going to provide. And then after I'd lectured, I would try to determine how I'm going to create tests or assess the students, what the evidence I was looking for them to demonstrate in their learning. I never really thought about their learning outcomes, what they should be doing. In backwards design, we start with those learning outcomes. What should the learners know and be able to do? Then we determine the acceptable evidence. How will we know they have achieved their desired outcomes? And then plan their learning experiences and instruction. What methods and materials and resources do we need to provide to the students? So you see, assessment here is critical. It's the center part of the design of a course. It's something that we would normally want to have thought about before we plan our instructional techniques. So assessment is very important. And there's been a lot that's been written on assessment. For today, we're going to cover three things. We're going to talk a little bit about learning outcomes and compare direct and indirect assessment methods. Most of the talk is going to be focused on matching assessment to learning outcomes. We'll have some questions about selecting the right assessment, and then I'll provide two examples of ways to tie assignments to learning outcomes, which are test blueprints and rubrics. There's different levels of learning outcomes, and they just differ by their specificity. For example, goals are learning outcomes that are maybe stated for a curriculum or a program of study. More specific learning outcomes are what you would use on a syllabus, and even more specific instructional outcomes are used for individual sessions, lectures, or limited sessions that might be an instructional module in a course. People may call these outcomes or a number of other things, but the focus of our today's talk is on things that we would put in our syllabus that describe what students will be able to do. What are the learning outcomes of the course? At any level, learning outcomes are sentences that have three parts. They have subjects and verbs and objects. So think about this for a second. What is the subject of a good learning outcome? What is the subject of the sentence? The subject is always the students, or you could use the learners, but it's the people that are we're expecting to learn are the subject of the sentence. So that's easy. We don't ever have to worry about that again. We just always use students when we're writing a learning outcome. The objects of the sentence are also fairly easy for most of us because these are the topics that are typically covered in the course. For example, this course may have employment statistics as one of the topics or one of the sections of the textbook. The key to writing good assessment instruments like tests and other assignments is knowing what the verb is in the learning outcome. What is it that the students will be able to do with the employment statistics helps us determine what our assessment methods will need to be. So here the students will project employment statistics. It tells us that the students will actually use the employment statistics to do something. It's not that the students will remember employment statistics or the students will be able to create employment statistics. It's very specific about what we're expecting the students to be able to do. In selecting the right verbs, it's helpful to refer to either the Bloom's taxonomy or the revised Bloom's taxonomy that was edited chiefly by Lauren Anderson. These are the learning outcome verbs from the revised Bloom's taxonomy, and this is what we're trying to use consistently here at the University of South Carolina. The lowest level of learning in this taxonomy is remembering, which is retrieving relevant information from long-term memory. A little more advanced type of knowledge is understanding, moving up, which is constructing meaning from oral and written and graphical communication. Applying involves carrying out or using a procedure in a given situation. Analyzing is where students break material into its constituent parts and determine how the parts relate to one another or to an overall structure or purpose. The highest levels of thought processes or cognition involve evaluating and creating, and evaluating makes judgments based on criterion and standards, and creating puts elements together to form a structure or reorganize elements in a new structure. Now, we have resources that are associated with this video that give you a lot of different verbs that will substitute for some of these verbs here in helping you develop the appropriate test questions. This slide compares a number of direct and indirect assessment methods. Well, actually, it doesn't compare them, it just lists them. On the right, we see some indirect assessment methods, which would include student surveys, graduate follow-ups, focus groups, and interviews. And these are called indirect assessment of learning outcomes because these are asking the learners or the post-learners, the graduates, to tell us what they thought they learned out of the course. So there's somewhat self-reported subjective information you would get from indirect assessment, which is helpful, particularly when combined with measures of direct assessment, which could include standardized tests, performance on licensure or professional exams depending on your discipline, could include student work such as essays and exhibits and performances and other course assignments. It could include compilations of work samples involving portfolios. Authentic assessments may be appropriate. For example, I know in some departments or disciplines such as nursing, the students actually have to be able to demonstrate they can perform certain procedures. Or you could look at job placement rates as a measurement of assessment of student achievement. The things that I want to talk about in this presentation are essays, exhibits, performances, and course assignments, and other examples where the instructors provide direct assessment through graded student work. So here's a test for you. Which is the right assessment method? I have 4 learning outcomes listed. Identify the signs and symptoms of multiple sclerosis, formulate food products, identify an area for research, and demonstrate good presentation skills. And we have different assessment techniques down the right that we might use: making a presentation to peers, preparing a 1,000-word research proposal, a lab-based project, and a multiple choice question, a type of exam. So which would you use for, let's say, formulating food products? If you wanted your students to formulate food products, would you have them make a presentation? Would you have them prepare a research proposal? Would you have them do a lab-based project or a multiple choice question exam? After you've made your choice, I want you to look at the words involved in the learning outcome. Formulate food products. Which of those 3 words were most important in helping you choose the appropriate assessment method? Was it formulate, which was the verb of the learning outcome, or was it food products, which are the objects or the course content? If you say food products, I would like to say that the students could certainly make a presentation on food products, or they could prepare a research proposal on food products. They could do a lab-based project on food products, or they could answer multiple choice questions about food products. So the content of the learning outcome in terms of the objective doesn't really help us select the right assessment method. The key is in the verb in the sentence, formulate. Formulate would involve making something, which would probably be best assessed in a lab-based project. So here we see that it is, again, the verb in the learning outcome that helps us select the most appropriate assessment method. And that's why we spend so much time talking about verbs. So here are some more examples of different verbs that are associated with the category in the taxonomy of knowledge called remembering. And I have listed here under the cognitive processes 2 different types of remembering: recognizing and recalling. Recognizing involves comparing knowledge from long-term memory when presented with information. And when I met with Lauren Anderson, he differentiated recognizing and recalling to me with this example. Let's say I met you a year ago, and then I met you again yesterday. And I may look at you and say, oh, I recognize your face. But then I may think for a second, but I don't recall your name. So recognizing is comparing the knowledge with presented information. So I see your face, I recall some I pull some information out of my brain that says, oh, I've seen that face before, and so I'm comparing what I know to what I see, and that's recognizing. Whereas recalling is retrieving knowledge from long-term memory when presented with a question. The question in this case being, what's your name? I don't have any clues, and so I'm not able to recall it. So you see, it's really a different thought process that's involved in recognizing and recalling. And so what is it you want your students to do? If you want them to recognize correct answers, then you would provide them assessments such as true-false questions, multiple choice, or matching items from two lists. If you want them to be able to recall information, then you would give them short answer questions, for example. And the difficulty of the short answer question may vary depending on the extent of providing hints and being placed within a larger context. In the rightmost column, I've given some question starters for different types of test questions you might use for these levels of cognition. For recognizing, you might ask the students to identify, select, label, arrange, order, repeat, copy, duplicate, match, or associate certain content. For recalling, you might ask them to locate, retrieve, list, name, reproduce, state, describe, cite, recite, define, quote. Now let's look at another level of the revised Bloom's taxonomy associated with the cognitive processes of analyzing. Now, there's a number of different ways students can demonstrate their ability to analyze information or knowledge. One is by organizing it, determining how elements fit within a structure. If you want students to be able to demonstrate they can organize information, you would ask them to provide an outline or a table or a matrix or some sort of hierarchical diagram of the information. Question starters could include analyze, organize this, outline it, draw it, diagram it, chart it, tabulate, or subdivide. Another cognitive process associated with analysis abilities is attributing, determining a point of view, intent, or purpose. And the assessment format you would choose here could involve either constructing or selecting a description of an author's point of view for written material. So if you are interested in having the students do written responses, then you might ask them to read something and then construct a description of the author's point of view. You can also test the analysis ability of attributing by asking them to select a description of an author's point of view from a number of choices, and this could be done with a multiple choice test. So those multiple choice tests written properly can be used to assess higher levels of learning and not just recognition. Starter questions for attributing could include ascribing, depicting, describing, inferring, and deducing. That we've talked about learning outcomes and the types of learning outcomes assessments that may be appropriate, I want to talk about two different strategies that can be used to document that your assignments do actually assess the learning outcomes you want them to. The first is called a test blueprint. It's often called a table of specifications. The test blueprint would list the key learning objectives of your exams that you've developed. Test blueprint would identify the number of points or test questions to be devoted to each one of your goals or learning outcomes. If done right, a test blueprint can provide evidence of a test validity, and when matched with test scores, can offer a clear set of evidence of what students have learned. Now, here's an example of a test blueprint. You see across the top row, there are listed 4 different course objectives, and these would be associated with the content that's to be tested on this exam, or the topics. And then down the leftmost column are the 6 levels of the revised Bloom's taxonomy. The numbers in the cells represent the numbers of test questions that that assess a course objective at each different level of the taxonomy. So for objective A, you see there's 1 question that just is a remembering question, 2 about understanding, 4 that asks the students to apply their knowledge, and 3 that asks them to analyze. And this is done for all of the test questions. And if you add the questions up to the right, you can sort of get an idea of how you're testing the students' thought processes in terms of what level. And you see in this particular example, most of the questions are in the application and analysis range, with a few simple remembering and understandings and a few more complicated evaluating and creating. You can also look down the columns and you can see to what extent your different course objectives are being assessed on this particular exam, and making sure that they're assessed equally, for example, if that's what your desire is. You can use a test blueprint to analyze an exam after it's made, but it's really more useful if you do it up front when you're developing the exam. And if you want to do that, you would first list the desired content areas or learning outcomes, for example, across the top of the matrix or table. Then list the intellectual or cognitive processes that you want to assess down the left side column. Then look at everything and determine the importance of the test content areas and processes. In other words, what percentage of the test you want to be in each one of those cells in the matrix. And then enter the number of items needed in the blanks where these content areas and processes overlap. Then go about selecting the questions for your test. And this way you can ensure that you're assessing all of your learning outcomes at the appropriate level with the instrument. And it also provides evidence that you're doing that. Rubrics are used for a lot of different types of assignments, and most typically they're used for written assignments by students, or performances, presentations, and things where there's not necessarily a right answer, but we're really evaluating the student's process skills. They are criterion-based rating scales that establish guidelines in evaluating assignments. They can be simple or comprehensive, but they should be pre-tested, and I will explain a reason why in just a second. I've got some examples of some rubrics here. The first is a simple checklist rubric, which just asks, are the important components of an assignment reflected in the student's work? And it's yes or no. So an example of a checklist rubric could look something like this, where you don't have to worry about the words, but we've got coming down here are a number of different performance criteria, or things that we expect to be in the student's assignment. And then there's a column for yes and a column for no, and a place for the evaluator to write comments. So this would be simply checking whether something's present or not, and then you can add up the number of yeses and the number of nos, and if you want to use that for a grade, you can, or you can just use it to determine whether students, or to show that the students are being assessed on the appropriate areas and some evidence of what they've achieved. Some of us like to give a little more differentiation back to the students, and we may want to use a rating scale rubric that characterizes their performance in different categories, such as excellent, good, satisfactory, fair, and poor, and assigns a numerical value to that. This is an example of a simple scale rubric that I used in my class last week, a mechanical engineering course on measurements and instrumentation experiments, and they have to write written reports. And in developing this rubric, I said, well, there has to be a title, there have to have a section on the objective of the lab, section that describes the instrumentation, the experimental procedures, and there was more that I'm not showing on this slide. And I wanted to tell them whether each section was excellent, very good, good, fair, poor, or whether it was just absent. And I chose the word null because I wanted to have a zero category, but sometimes a section just wasn't present, and I didn't want to give them a 1 point for not doing anything, so I added that. And by circling the number in the various cells, that gave me a score that I could add up to grade the students with, and it also gave them feedback of how well they had done on the assignment. Now, I didn't simply use a 5-point rating scale for each one of these things for 2 reasons. First of all, the different sections that I required them turn in required different amounts of work. For example, the procedure section was the longest, and so it was worth 27 points total. And describing the variables that would be controlled or changing, they could get a maximum of 10 points out of that, which would be a lot more work than just having a title that describes a report concisely, which would get 2 points for that title. So I used different scales and weighted them that way. And the other thing that, I knew that the first time I designed the rubric, but then I had a problem with my first pass through because I used uniformly distributed the points from excellent to poor. So for example, for describing the variables that would be controlled, I had 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, and 0 rather than what you see here of 10, 9, 8, 7, 4. And that was problematic, I realized after grading the third report, because I was telling students that they had done good but they had gotten a 6, which is just barely a passing grade in my class, because 0 to 60 is failing and 60 to 100 is, the letter grades. So I went back and I revised the rubric to better match my grading scale by giving 10, 9, 8, 7 for the various passing grades and 4 for the poor. So the important thing was that I developed the rubric. I thought it was good. I graded some exams, some reports. It wasn't working for me, so I revised the rubric before I went all the way through. And that was a way of pre-testing it before I applied it to evaluating all the students. Now, you may not be happy with just simply telling the students they're good, fair, or poor. You may want to provide some more detail to them. And you can do that with a detailed rating scale rubric, which provides common performance standards, makes the scores more consistent. All of these rubrics can be given to students along with the assignment in advance, but the detailed rating scale gives clear expectations of what the students will be expected to do. And this is what one would look like. You would have different categories of the components of the assignment or the learning outcomes that you expect to be exhibited. And then in each of the cells, you would have a written description of what they want to do. This particular rubric is for creating a musical performance. Writing a musical. So for example, in the song choice, an excellent performance by the student would be having the writer use vivid songs that linger or draw pictures in the reader's mind, whereas a very poor performance would be using songs that do not communicate strongly or capture the reader's interest or do not fit in as dialogue. Now, these things can take a long time to write, and if you have a lot of categories of criteria that you're expecting in assignments, these rubrics can be very long, but they do provide a lot of good detailed information to the students and tell them exactly what they need to be working on in order to get accomplish what's intended in the class. There's a lot of rubrics on the web, and so you don't have to start from scratch. We found this website called rubistar.forteachers.org, which is an organization that was developed and funded by a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which uses forms and drawdown boxes to create a rubric for a number of different topics. And honestly, this is where I got the rubric that I just showed for writing a musical, because as a mechanical engineering professor, I probably wouldn't have done a very good job with that. But what I found was that after you create your rubric with this website, you can copy and paste from the website into your own word processing document and edit the different sections to make it more appropriate. So it may be a good place to start for you. That concludes the prepared material, but I want you to sit there and think for a moment about what challenges you face in assessing your learning outcomes and